talked about the Section 3, 14th Amendment, disqualification of Trump issue, so-called, for a couple of years. I've written about it, talked about it more recently here on Levin TV, even on the Fox show, particularly with Hannity. But I need to write the killer piece. The piece that all the legal analysts will be peeking at and cherry-picking. And then they'll try and show us how smart they are. But you and I, we have a relationship, so I really wrote this for you. And I sent it to the folks at the Blaze, and they thanked me, and they posted it the very next morning, which is this morning. I want to thank those of you who have already read it. I want to thank the other platforms that have also sought the link to it. Those that didn't, well, screw off. Now, it's called the Democrat Party's Fetish for the 14th Amendment is a vile attack on our elections directed at one man, Donald Trump. The modern Democrat Party has an unhealthy fetish for the 14th Amendment, one of the three post-Civil War constitutional amendments. Democrats are constantly and relentlessly trying to rewrite it to accommodate their political ends. A few months ago, Joe Biden and his party insisted that Section 4 of the 14th Amendment granted the president power to unilaterally increase the debt ceiling, which would destroy Congress's sole power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, as we've discussed, to tax, spend, and borrow. Of course, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment does no such thing, and there's nothing in the history of the amendment that supports such an interpretation. Here's the relevant language. The validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So in other words, as I explain in my new book, the Democrat Party hates America. Nobody was challenging the validity of the debt. Second, the language is specific to Civil War-related debt. Third, the language says nothing about fundamentally altering the way the federal government raises revenue or pays debt. Fourth, to repeat the language in legislative history in no way support the proposition that the core power of Congress was replaced or repealed. Fifth, the language does not and was never intended to abolish separation of powers, which is core to our constitutional system. The proponents of this absurdity would have turned Biden into a bigger dictator than he already is. But none of this mattered to the proponents. They seek power at any cost, and they will be using this again. The Democrat Party, their media, and their academicians cannot rewrite the Constitution by interpretation. Then they argue for abolishing it altogether and replacing it with a more so-called relevant document. That is, a document that ensures their monopoly power and destroys our founding principles. After all, how many times have they told us that the Constitution was written by slaveholders, perpetuates racism and inequity, and is illegitimate? The same kind of fraudulent approach is now before us with respect to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Here's the text that these constitutional saboteurs, in the name of the Constitution, are desperately and cravenly insisting prevents former President Donald Trump from effectively running for a second presidential term. It says no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. You need not be an aging retired judge like Michael Ludig, washed-up former law professor like Lawrence Tribe, or never-Trumper academician like these two knuckleheads from the Federalist Society, to notice that the word president cannot be found in this text. I'm not talking about electors for a president. The word president. So why would the amendment's drafters, adopters, and ratifiers, and I use those three words purposely, people draft the amendment, 2/3 of both houses of Congress adopted it, and it was ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's a lot of people. Why did all of them exclude the word president from the text, but include virtually every other form of office holder, federal and state, elected and appointed in the text? Did they forget to add the word president? Or could the reason possibly be that they did not want to include the word president and therefore intentionally did not? Of course, there's nothing anywhere that even suggests that the drafters, adopters, or ratifiers intended otherwise. It took two never-Trumper law professors, members of the Federalist Society no less, joining the Democrat Party mob, over 125 pages, to try and convince us that by omitting the word president, not only did the drafters, adopters, and ratifiers intend to include the president, but the proper interpretation of the amendment and its construction and application made it undeniable and clear. In fact, so clear are these professors and their ilk that we're supposed to intuit the intention of the drafters, adopters, and ratifiers by, among other things, the words, quote, as an officer of the United States, unquote. So this phrase, we are told, should be read to include the word president. Therefore, there was no need, they tell us, to single out by name the most powerful and important governmental official in the entire country. Really? Consequently, the argument goes, of course the president was intended to be included in the amendment by general reference to officer. Notice they mentioned senators, congressmen, state legislators, state judges. They left out the president. Wow. But they meant to include it. That's the point. Now, did they also mean to leave out the local South Carolina county commissioner? He wasn't specifically mentioned either. So this is preposterous. For most people, the absurdity is self-evident. Indeed, if they intended to include the president, you'd think he would not only be mentioned, but that he'd be at the top of the list of all the officials included in the text. In fact, they even mentioned electorate, president, and vice president, but not the president himself. Moreover, what does the phrase shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States actually mean? If you're going to bar the leading Republican candidate for the presidency from even appearing on a state ballot, thereby disenfranchising untold numbers of citizens who would like to vote for him and potentially alter the course and outcome of a presidential election, should be some definitive way to know what this phrase means and who gets to make that decision. Obviously, as the 14th Amendment is one of the so-called Civil War amendments, we know what was meant when the amendment was ratified. Engaging in insurrection or rebellion on behalf of the Confederacy and against the Union, a.k.a. the Civil War. It wasn't very difficult to figure out who did or did not engage in such activities or what was meant by insurrection or rebellion. The Civil War. They didn't need law professors or members of the Democrat Party, that is the party of the Confederacy, to tell them. But did the drafters, adopters, and ratifiers intend Section 3 to apply beyond the death of the last Confederate? Of course, there's no evidence that it did, other than the wishful meanderings and self-serving declarations of the proponents. Strangely, however, if that was the true intention and purpose, the amendment doesn't provide any guidance whatsoever on how these decisions would be presented and resolved in the case of a presidential candidate or president. I say strangely because at the Constitutional Convention, the framers spent a great deal of time debating and working through the way they elected presidents. They came up with the Electoral College system, it didn't take long until it was evident that even that process needed some adjustment. So the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. If in 1868 the drafters, adopters, and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment intended it not only to apply to a presidential candidate or president, but knew it could upset this intricate manner in which we elect presidents, upset the presidential election process, well, why did they say absolutely nothing about it? What are we supposed to do about all that? For example, how is it determined whether a presidential candidate or president engaged in an insurrection or rebellion against the United States when he's not been charged with, let alone convicted of such offenses? You won't find the answer in the 14th Amendment. That would seem to be an essential question in need of a definitive answer. Did the men behind Section 3 intend that a presidential candidate be barred from a state ballot based merely on accusations? And accusations from whom? The media, Democrat Party officials, operatives, and litigators, academicians, never-Trumpers? In fact, the second impeachment trial against President Trump fell well short of the number of senators needed to convict him for the events of January 6th. As a result, he was not barred under Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution from, quote, holding and enjoying any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. If anything, there was a constitutional adjudication in Trump's favor. Indeed, on January 4, 48 hours before the so-called January 6th insurrection, President Trump offered to call up 10,000 National Guardsmen to protect the Capitol building and Congress during the official Electoral College count. The Democrat Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and the D.C. Democrat mayor refused the offer. These facts are intentionally ignored by the Biden regime special counsel, as they were by the Democrat Party's so-called January 6th committee. And they ignore it because a president clearly is not engaged in an insurrection or rebellion when he offers thousands of armed troops to do precisely the opposite. Moreover, does any serious scholar believe that the post-Civil War Congress was so committed to preserving this extreme notion of federalism that it would have written an amendment giving a single state the power to upend a federal presidential election? Would that Congress have believed when it was drafting and adopting Section 3 that it was granting power to a state official, say a Secretary of State or Attorney General, to unilaterally bar a leading presidential candidate from the state's ballot, thereby possibly affecting the outcome of a national election, or for that matter, even a state legislature? No way. In fact, the post-Civil War Congresses were mostly hostile to states' rights. Several southern states remained occupied military territories until they capitulated to the demands of the federal government. This federal government was on a roll. It wasn't going to start handing out powers to the states, including the power to prevent a federal presidential election outcome. Putting aside all the issues raised previously, one can only imagine the Pandora's box this would open. It was not opened by the people who drafted that amendment. This entire movement is a vile assault on the electoral process directed at a single individual, Donald Trump. There's absolutely no constitutional basis for it. However, if somehow it succeeds, the implications will live far beyond today. We're left not with the rule of law, but the rule of men, and in this case, the rule of the Democrat Party and its officials and operatives and their academic allies. The party of the Confederacy once again seeks to nullify the federal Constitution and the nation's electoral system, disenfranchise tens of millions of voters nationwide, and push the country toward its breaking point, from which we may never recover. This entire movement. It's worth remembering the Democrat Party and surrogates are a power-hungry lot. They're also driving out other dangerously illegitimate, self-serving attacks on our voting system. How many times have we heard from Democrat activists and others that the Electoral College should be abolished? It's a racist system set up by white slaveholders to perpetuate racism, etc. Of course, this is another anti-American lie. The purpose of the Electoral College is, in part, to ensure that all parts of the country have a say in the election of a president and vice president, not just the most populous areas, and to prevent mob rule by way of unchecked majoritarianism. Thus, the Electoral College is an institutional block on the Democrat Party's efforts to monopolize our voting system. So they want to get rid of it, since most densely populated areas of the nation are run by Democrats. Democrat Party is behind another unconstitutional scheme that seeks to disenfranchise tens of millions. It's called the National Popular Vote Movement. That would circumvent the Electoral College and enable 11 to 14 of the biggest blue states, by popular vote, throw their Electoral College votes to the person who wins the most popular votes in the country, ensuring the election of a Democrat in many cases. The Democrat Party is also relentlessly attempting to nationalize state voting systems. Remember H.R. 1? Remember how they wanted to nationalize all the state election rules? This is the party. These are the people who cover from some odd-thinking professors who are organizing around a twisted fiction for banning Trump from the ballot and disenfranchising his would-be voters in advance of the election.